So, very honoured to be sat with Dr. Shabbir Akhtar. We're just going to go straight into it. Our discussion today will be focusing around what we spoke about before, which would be Islamophobia. The question is, in this context, is it possible to have a definition of Islamophobia? And maybe before we even get there, how did Islamophobia come about?
It is possible to have a definition. There need not be an academically precise or rigorous definition, but I don't personally think you actually need it. I think that with key concepts like democracy or Islamophobia in this case, these are essentially contested ideas, meaning it's in their nature to be subject to many different kinds of interpretations. So I think it's sufficient to have a gut feeling or an intuition about what it means. So for example, if you felt in a job interview, let's say, that your name was the main reason that you weren't chosen, even though you were, let's say, demonstrably, you had the merit, then I think it's reasonable to suspect that there was some prejudice against you, which is what Islamophobia would mean.
But then how would we distinguish or differentiate between something being just regular racism and then Islamophobia?
Yes, that's an important question, Mamadou. I think that in order to understand that, you need to have a brief overview of, let's say, from the 1960s to now. That's almost 50 odd years, half a century of issues regarding race. In the earliest decades, meaning in the 60s and 70s, essentially everybody who wasn't white thought of themselves as black, which was this signifier of political solidarity against white racism. So the people in that who would be the victims of racism would be, Afro-Caribbeans, Pakistanis, Indians, anyone, East African, anyone who wasn't white. I think that the Rushdie affair, Salman Rushdie affair in 1989 was the watershed that led to the emergence of a different type of prejudice that was religiously motivated. Okay. And it singled out Muslims. Because Muslims were different from other communities in the sense that, though a minority in the United Kingdom, they belong to a larger global fellowship, the Ummah of Islam. So, for example, to give you a personal example, in my years, from the late 60s onwards, growing up in this country as a child, I remember it being quite frequent that I would go to school and children would mock me saying, "Oh, your country's at war with," maybe with India over the development of Bangladesh, right, in the early 70s, or the 6-Day War with Israel. Something involving a Western power attacking a Muslim nation. And basically, as a child, you're caught up. Then 1979 was a major watershed, the Islamic Revolution in Iran. So I'm saying throughout my teenage years, adolescence, I found myself at odds with my fellow students and sometimes teachers, because they would always cite some kind of political event abroad, not inside England. Inside England, where I grew up in northern industrial England, Bradford, the debates were, to be fair, ones which we covered under the general rubric of race relations. So, for example, if Muslims demanded certain kinds of special needs and requirements, these could be accommodated within the state sector. So the government would say, yes, we can have halal meat. It's understandable. Modest dress for girls in physical education, fine. I think that what preceded the Rushdie affair was the Honeyford affair, in which there was some concern about the education of particularly Pakistanis, that their parents would send them back to Pakistan, often at random, without regard to holiday schedule, and that this affected their education. And I think this was a reasonable concern. I don't think that it was necessarily motivated solely by racist motives. But I think with the Rushdie affair, you get the Muslims singled out. But the development of this prejudice, I think, goes back to foreign policy issues, as I was mentioning, Muslim nations being attacked.
It's very interesting. So you're saying, in your view then, Muslims start getting singled out after Salman Rushdie. What do you think led to that? The Muslims started to be singled out?
Well, I think the idea was that Muslims were an especially problematic community. That while other communities had integrated or assimilated, depending on what you mean by these terms, roughly speaking, other communities, Sikhs, Hindus, it was perceived, had successfully integrated into British culture and into British educational system, that they were doing well in terms of economics, and that the Muslims were somehow underachieving And the religion was an impediment to their success. The religion was holding them back. The religion was seen as especially violent, intolerant, but also I think the fear that it was an imperial religion. Don't forget that before the Europeans colonized the entire Muslim world, Muslims had in the early centuries, 8th century onwards, colonized parts of Europe.
Yes.
And under the Ottomans, they had colonized most of Eastern Europe. Yes. So before Europe was a colonizer of the Muslims had been under a number of dynasties, colonizers of the West. So I think at a subconscious, subliminal level, this was a deep anxiety that these people, is it an invasion by some other means? Demography, they've got lots of children. Yeah. So again, the word phobia is correctly used here. I mean, if I can just mention that about the word phobia. For example, let's take a number of statistical facts and see how we analyze them in the context of this prejudice against Islam. It's often remarked that the first name Muhammad is the commonest male name in Europe. And of course, racists and bigots and Islamophobes interpret this to mean that this country will be under the Sharia in no time, because look, almost every third child or whatever born is called Muhammad. Well, another way of interpreting the same material could be that Muslims are particularly unimaginative when they give first names to their male children. They could call them something else. Although, mind you, calling him Osama might not be much of an improvement on Muhammad. But you see my point. Another example of how statistics can be misinterpreted because of the Islamophobic prejudicial lens. I often get people saying to me in Oxford, where I live and teach in the university, how come there's so many mosques here? There's not that many Muslims. And of course, there's a lot of international elite who come as Muslim students who don't mix much with the community. What about the ordinary community? Aren't 3 mosques enough? I said, yes, we historically have roughly 3 mosques, 1 major, 2 minor. And they say, well, how come we heard rumors that another mosque was about to be built, let's say by the Somali community? And I think that the number of mosques is interpreted by Islamophobes as evidence that Islam is invading this country and taking over, when in fact the correct interpretation of the number of mosques in Oxford, for example, is the rise in sectarianism among Muslims. Somalis, we don't want to pray with Pakistanis, there's some kind of tension, we're going to have our own mosque. Arab students, often from wealthy backgrounds, have hired out a hall in a community centre, a white community centre, just for Friday, because they're not happy to pray in the Sunni Muslim mosque where I worship in Manzil, because they perceive it as being too Sufi oriented, too much praise of the Prophet, which makes them uncomfortable. The kind of Wahhabi literalism that can say, so for example, in practice, when I'm at the mosque on Fridays particularly, I find that after the Friday prayer, most of the Pakistanis will stay behind to sing Naat in honor of the Prophet, whereas most of the Arab brothers I know, many of whom are friends of mine, will rush out of the mosque because they want to avoid that. So they've done their prayer, they've done their fard, and that's it. So I think that we can interpret what looks like the tide of Islam, taking over Europe, and look at each statistical data in a sober way, and you find that there's an alternative explanation. Which is not to say, by the way, that Islam isn't gaining strength. It is indeed, often at the expense of the indigenous Anglican Church, which is in a state of irreversible decline.
Irreversible decline meaning? I understand the terms, but...
Irreversible decline means that it has reached a critical point from which there's no return. So for my own opinion, if I may predict the future on the future of the Anglican faith, is that it will be entirely irrelevant in the next 20 years or so, meaning it will remain a ceremonial relic within the institutions. So of course the Archbishop of Canterbury will place the crown on the Queen's head, but beyond that, it doesn't have any real power because congregations are dwindling. Most of the fervour that you see in the Christian churches is actually from African Christians, evangelicals imported from America, Eastern European Catholics. And unfortunately, these communities, unlike the Anglicans, do contribute to a fair degree of Islamophobia because many of them are fervently and ferociously evangelical rather. I mean, for example, just now when I was coming to London, I sat on a bench outside the Oxford station waiting for my train, and I believe a Nigerian Christian woman, I know she's Nigerian because she told me that, just said hello to me, very super friendly, it was very nice. even offered me something to eat, a snack. And then, of course, her hidden agenda was she wanted to convert me to Christianity. And I said, well, no, thank you. I declined the gift because I'd read most of this stuff. I said, no, I'm well aware of the Christian faith. I'm actually, I teach Christian-Muslim relations in the University of Oxford. So I'm obviously very well aware of the issues. And I declined. I didn't say much about why I was declined, but I said, look, I have my own faith, and to live peacefully without prejudice. You know, there's such a term as Christianophobia too, by the way, which has been coined by people at Theos, which is a think tank. The argument is basically that the religion that is most persecuted in the world is not Islam. It's a myth. There's no such thing as Islamophobia. That word was just invented by Muslim polemicists to gain extra sympathy. The real persecution is that of Christians, often in Muslim majority countries. So I'm saying that lady's apparent friendliness was unfortunately a mask for proselytization, which I think is dangerous in a interfaith setting. And I think it contributes to Islamophobia, actually, that the Muslims are perceived as being resistant to offers of another faith. They're resistant to integration in white culture. They decline alcohol even as a social lubricant, meaning just, drinking for the sake of, being in a party. Even declining that, which is considered social, opposed drinking, like somebody pretending to smoke a cigarette in a film, just pretending. In other words, the Muslims not even willing to do that. It's seen as a kind of rejection of the host culture, especially if it's allied with forms of clothing which are seen as a way for a Muslim woman to say to white people, keep away from me, especially with the niqab.
Is there, in your opinion then, speaking about Islamophobia and then that naturally ties into culture, is there a correlation between a spike in Islamophobia and then with Muslims declining or not assimilating or integrating into wider culture?
It's a fascinating question, Mamadou. I've actually lived in North America, in America for 10 years, in Canada for 5 years, and I can say that there is much less Islamophobia, even actually in America, in my view, than in Britain. And I think this is a surprising finding, but it comes from personal experience. I think part of the reason is that in particularly a country like Canada, young Muslims feel that they're accepted. Whereas I think in Britain the feeling is among people born, let's say, in the late 90s, right, millennials, even they feel that though they were born here, that they're not fully accepted.
But is that accepted from the culture, or is that accepted because they have refused to engage with the wider culture? Because you find some places in the UK as solely pockets of that ethnic group. And I'm dismayed and utterly shocked when I see people born here and they have accents who are not British accents.
Well, I think that the question of integration is obviously bilateral. I mean, for example, there was a report done by the Commission for Racial Equality, I believe, recently, about 4 or 5 years ago, arguing that some shocking statistics that, let's say, 40% of Muslims had never entered a non-Muslim home, right? Well, that is shocking, but the question is, do non-Muslims invite Muslims to their home? Isn't, the rejection of Western culture on the grounds that it's allegedly decadent by Muslims may be offensive to Westerners, but aren't there lots of Westerners who buy a property away from a particular area as soon as they think Asians are moving in? I mean, when I grew up in Bradford, it became a ghetto over time. When I first went there as a child, it was mixed. Then, what's called white flight, which is where white people go into properties, in the suburbs as soon as Muslims move into poorer districts of Manningham and Heaton, places where I grew up. And I think this phenomenon is actually there in America. I remember living in Norfolk, Virginia, where I was a professor in Old Dominion University, and a lot of my black students said to me that, sir, many white neighbors of ours have gone to Virginia Beach, which is a nearby city, and they mentioned the term white flight to me, saying it was quite normal, because I asked them why the population of Norfolk, Virginia, which is the world's largest naval base of the US Navy, why there were so many black people there and not, say, half-half. And they said, well, sir, this is a recent phenomenon. It's because as more black people moved in, white people just instinctively moved out. So, of course, you have to put the blame on the host community too. I mean, like, for example, in Canada, you don't get this ghettoization. That's a very marked feature of America and indeed of Britain.
So it's very interesting. So I know you speak a lot about, I mean, we can come back to the topic of Islamophobia, but I want to kind of pick your mind a little bit. I know we speak a lot about secularism and liberalism as well. First of all, I know it's a very wide question, but hopefully we can start with that and then narrow it down. Can Islam and secularism exist together?
If secularism is defined as a political ideology that is totalitarian, making claims of an absolute kind, as it does in the laïcité French system, then unfortunately at some metaphysical and civilizational level there will be tension. Which is not to say that in practice there can't be pragmatic accommodation. They can. For example, in the Rushdie affair, we have an actual example of where Muslims felt that God's law conflicted with the state law of the United Kingdom. Now, because the United Kingdom is a country whose citizenship I've adopted, I've been naturalized, I wasn't born here, obviously I'm under a moral and legal obligation to obey its laws. Yes. So although we had civil disobedience and destroyed a copy of the book and demonstrated all perfectly legal in a democracy as citizens, the idea of murdering somebody is not something that we could have endorsed. Obviously, as you know, it came from outside the United Kingdom because that would be contravening the laws of this country to which we have pledged loyalty. So in that sense, yes, I think it's perfectly possible for secularism and Islam in practice, for pragmatic reasons, to coexist. The difficulty is, however, where these conflicts are regular. I mean, thank God the Rushdie affair happened 30 years ago. There's no repeat of something on that level. Yeah. There have been cartoons and individual insults, and many newspapers in Britain have refused to reprint Danish cartoons on the grounds of social cohesion, public disorder. And so we've got some awareness culturally that let's make an amendment to the Public Disorder Act so we don't offend people who are living together. Yeah. In other words, we don't destroy social cohesion just to please a small group of elite liberals, who want to insult everyone maliciously. I think that the deeper question actually is not one of law, but of decency. I mean, why should one have so much malice in one's heart that one wants to offend people who are decent and are just going about trying to lead a good life? One of the things that troubles me is that people say in the area of free speech, for example, liberals say, well, what's wrong with insulting Muslims? After all, in the Charlie Hebdo case, for example, those people had insulted many French people, including French Catholics. Yeah. Well, the answer to that is there's one thing to insult people who are quite powerful already in the world, who can take some degree of satire and insult because they can do counter-satire, because they also own some of the big publishing houses. You insult somebody who's got nothing, poor housing, poverty, lives in a perpetual cycle of underachievement academically for his children, works in a low-paid job. The only source of his or her dignity is Islam, the unnegotiable respect for the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. Then you go and attack him, the one thing that gives meaning to his life, the only thing that gives meaning to his life. The rest of his life is full of poverty and racism and victimization. And the one thing he cares about deeply is his faith. You go and attack that too, which is what Rushdie did. I think that is immoral. That is my issue. It's not about legality. Not only are we not concerned about the legal issues, we do not know the niceties of the British law, English law. Of course, as you know, it only protected the Anglican Church at the time of the Rushdie affair, and since then it's become even more watered down, and the blasphemy laws no longer apply. So I think it's unfair to expect recent migrants, or even migrants for 40 odd years now, to be culturally so safe in this country as to be thick-skinned and not mind. I think people do mind. If you've got nothing going for you except your faith, and somebody comes and insults you about the one thing that you hold dear, of course you're going to be upset. Yes. It seems to me a completely unwise policy for a democracy that is mature, like the United Kingdom is a mature democracy, to deliberately go around making provocative comments just to please a group of artists who are basically victims of the idolatry of art. That's an expression I used at the time of the Rushdie affair, that these people are idolaters. That they worship themselves mainly, of course, right? So that's what secularism becomes. I mean, that's what secularism can become. Hubris, self-esteem to the point that man is the only God, right? Man is the measure of all things. And that's obviously, even if you're not a Muslim or a Jew or a Christian, that's obviously a very morally suspect view. If you actually think that by you I mean Western liberal man in 21st century Europe and America is the epitome of human evolution. So we've had millions of years of evolution, and the climax of that is Salman Rushdie.
Yeah, but for young people now, so we've got as I said before, we've got a generation that's in the UK now, born in the UK, second, third generation, they're educated in Western institutes. Wouldn't it be better for people to become scholars of these traditions? For example, young persons become a scholar of secularism, become a scholar of liberalism, and do you think that's advisable, and if so, why?
Well, I myself, in my own intellectual biography, I did a doctorate after my studies in philosophy at Cambridge, which was already an unusual choice. If you're the son of working class Asian parents, you become a doctor or an engineer, which is a good thing. Yeah. It's a stable job. I did philosophy, it was my passion. And then I did a doctorate on a Christian philosopher. So I moved outside my own tradition completely. Even though I was always and remained a committed Muslim, I was very interested in Christianity on its own terms. So my doctorate was on that. My most recent work is a 3-volume commentary on the Greek text of the New Testament, the first such work in Islamic history, which was why I was appointed in the faculty in Oxford. So yeah, I'm very interested. I personally think that intellectual curiosity is a byproduct of political power. And that when people are powerful, as when Muslims were powerful, it was natural to be curious about the faith. The reason we are not curious about other people is because we're so weak, we're just concerned to defend ourselves all the time. And the reason why the West is so intellectually curious about every civilization on earth is because they're politically powerful. It's not because Westerners are smarter by definition, right? The difficulty is that, we have to earn a living. Somebody might say, well, it's all right, Dr. Shabbir Akhtar, for you to say, why should we do DPhils in theology and philosophy at Oxford or Cambridge or Edinburgh or whatever, but where are the jobs? Well, this is a concern. I mean, we don't have an infrastructure, Mamadou, to absorb these new coming intellectuals. I mean, I've had to struggle in my academic career. Wherever there was a job, I had to go to it. And of course, if you've got integrity, then it's difficult. But the value of what I've done and what I would encourage some Muslims to do, not all of them, is this, that if you produce a counter narrative to the Western narrative on secularism and you work in a Muslim institution, that's an achievement, but nobody's going to listen to you. But if you live and work within the Western scholarly academic tradition, let's say in Oxford, feudal academia, and then you produce a counter-narrative from within that system to say that Islam has every right to be on the intellectual map of the world, it's a decent civilization, it's a great culture, it's a great ideology, then I think it is a very difficult achievement, because of course you'll make many enemies.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. But that's the point. Produce the counter-narrative while living within the what's called within the whale. Within the whale is George Orwell's term. You're living within, in so to speak, enemy territory, and yet you manage to say something true, speaking truth to power. Like Noam Chomsky has spoken truth to capitalist power while living in America. It's an achievement. I'd advise him actually to move to Canada.
Okay, but would you feel, are we creating a kind of, is it as bad as we say it is in England? Or are we just scaremongering? That's a question I want to put to you.
Yeah. It's a very good question, Mohammed. All your questions, by the way, are very searching and good. You should be a philosopher. Yeah, forget all these other studies you're doing in law and Arabic. Yeah. When I was involved in the Rushdie affair, I made this point in my book, Be Careful, Muhammad, that just because we've come up with a problem or a tension or a dilemma does not mean we should overlook the genuine achievements of multiculturalism and of the race relations industry, which I think on the whole was well motivated, even though in my view was also ineffective. Right? Not enough resources perhaps. But the people who worked in it, particularly people like Lord Bhikkhu Parekh, were great thinkers, visionaries and good men who were committed to anti-racism. And in fact, in the case of Lord Parekh, very, very supportive of the Muslims during the Rushdie affair. So I don't think that things are as bad. I think the level of religious tolerance has been until recently very high in the United Kingdom. And certainly by contrast to countries such as France and Germany, where I've traveled extensively, and Scandinavia, where I've lived for a while, I think Britain is actually much more tolerant. I'm not sure, however, whether this tolerance is due to the fact that this country is very secular and perhaps indifferent, which is not a bad thing. If indifference means you're going to tolerate your neighbour rather than fanatically attacking him, it's a good thing to be indifferent. But I think there's a degree of indifference in a country like Britain. What struck me was how similar phenomenon. I was in Japan teaching English for a while, and I noticed that there was a kind of indifference to religion. So the people were tolerant because they were indifferent.
Okay.
As you know, at the height of Islam's supremacy in the world, Islam insisted on tolerance of the Jews and Christians as people of the book, even though Islam was powerful enough to destroy them.
Yeah.
Because the true test of tolerance is when you are powerful. Everybody is tolerant when they're weak. Right? So I think that I'm not quite sure what the motive is in England for the tolerance. I think I've seen disturbing trends, however, in the last.
I think it's very important to touch on these trends now. So there's no doubt there's been a rise in far-right populism and populist movements across Europe, and it's creeping into the UK. Why is that the case now? Why have we gone from so we've had that Muslims have been singled out from 1989 Salman Rushdie affair. Then we've had some kind of a lot of tolerance has been built, even by law, and then we've gone backwards again. Why is that the case?
Why is there so much hostility to Islam at all levels of society? Well, I think it depends on which levels of society, if I may come on to that, because that's crucial. See, the kind of Islamophobia that you would get from the editor of an elite newspaper, let's say the Daily Telegraph, or from an elite philosopher such as Roger Scruton, is very different from the kind of racism that, for example, I remember experiencing directly on the, can I be a bit autobiographical?
Yeah, of course.
On a late train from Euston, London to Brighton. I used to live in Brighton. This train, just before midnight, was nicknamed the actors' train because many actors had houses in Brighton who came for the theatre. Of course, I'm not an actor or a theatre man, but I used to commute. I lived in Brighton when I worked at the Muslim Institute, which was run by the late Dr. Kaleem Sadiqi, may God give him Jannah, Ameen. I found that on that train, on a couple of occasions, I was victimized. Let's say a white drunk man would come up to me and say, go back to Iraq, which of course, is meaningless, insult me. Go back to Pakistan on occasion, which is meaningful because I am from Pakistan. I came here when I was 9 years old, so this was a meaningful insult in a sense. But the difficulty is that type of racism of the man in the train is not much to worry about. Of course, it can be a problem if you're a Muslimah and it's obvious from your clothing that you're a Muslim woman and you could be, targeted. Of course, I worry about that kind of thing. But I think generally speaking, what we have to worry about more is the racism of elite institutions, of the middle class, professions, media. Thoughtful racism, which is more reasoned out, whose prejudices are more inveterate, maybe because British people feel they've lost an empire, and they somehow think that, that it's a reminder of the intransigence and stubbornness of Muslims, that even under the empires of the French and the British, Muslims were the few people who had independence movements. I think there's a feeling that these people are particularly awkward and stubborn, and which is a power complex, because Muslims feel that they have a right, like countries such as Iran feel, well, if other nations can have nuclear weapons, why are we singled out? Obviously, there's a power complex. America's powerful, and it wants to say other nations who would like to be powerful, no, you can't be powerful, only we can be powerful. What I was going to say is that the man on the train, unlike the editor of The Spectator, for example, or some other magazine which is, anti-Muslim, is that I cannot say to this person who's probably uneducated and probably has his own problems in life, lack of privilege, maybe he feels marginalized as a white man, no housing. So, we can have due sympathy with him. Only thing we need to educate him is that, look, your difficulties, your lack of a job or decent housing is not because of us. It's because of the policies of the middle class and the upper class in this country. Complain to them. So, for example, I cannot say to this man, much as I'd like to on the train, that the reason I'm here and the reason I don't go back to Pakistan is because of the economic consequences of British imperialism. I think he might punch me if I use some such complex expression. But the explanation is that, India, what's now Pakistan as well, were under almost 400 years of colonial British rule. There was exploitation of resources. So when my father was in the army, there were no jobs except being in the army. So he wanted to come to another country to try his luck. And of course the Commonwealth, many people came to England, the mother country, from Australia, the white Commonwealth, as well as from India and East Africa. The entire world came here looking for jobs. So I'm saying that that's the origins of the problems, economic problems that the Muslims are having, along with other peoples of the Caribbean and so on. But how do you explain that to a racist who belongs to, a populist right-wing government, a skinhead, for example.
Yeah.
But, what disturbs me is that you can't explain this even to people who are, let's say, my fellow Oxford Dons. I think they have a tendency to be dismissive of this. The idea is, well, colonialism ended about 70 years ago, but did it really end? I mean, hasn't colonialism continued in some form? Indeed, somebody might say even the Crusades have continued. America is a Christian superpower and continues to attack several Muslim weak nations. Isn't that a kind of crusade? If Saladin al-Ayyubi was resurrected from the dead, would he not say not much has changed?
But we seem to be using the term here, racism and Islamophobia, almost interchangeably. And I know some people always retort with, but Islam is not a race though.
Sorry, say that?
Islam is not a race. People will retort, Islam is not a race, so what?
Okay, all right, let me come on to that. Islam is not a race, that's certainly true. It's a universal religion applicable to the entire human race. But it's a fact of history that, tragically, no important European or Western nation is Muslim, with the exception of Bosnia, which unfortunately is not an important nation, and it's the outcome of a massacre and a genocide, which, by the way, is something, let us hope and pray, won't happen here. Although, I did write in 1989 in The Guardian that the next time there are gas chambers in Europe, there's no doubt concerning who will be inside them. This was in 1989. I was mocked for that comment. This can't happen. Well, a mere 4 years later, the Serbians were massacring and raping people in Bosnia, Herzegovina. So was it so far off the target? Right? And that was just 5 years. And I remember The Guardian issuing me an apology because they'd printed a lot of letters in 1989 in the aftermath of my comments from people saying this is warmongering and stupid and retarded. And it turned out to be true. So I would say that race is certainly, Islam is not an ethnic religion, unlike Sikhism or Judaism, which are ethnic religions. Islam is a religion whose, obviously, its key events are Arab. The Quran is in Arabic, the Prophet is an Arab, the pilgrimage is to an Arab city, Arabic, in the Jazirat al-Arab. But it's a religion for all of humanity. But the fact that historically, Islam is not the religion of any important white nation, I think is important. Because if it were, let's suppose, as an accident of history, Islam were the religion of Spain, which it isn't because we were expelled in 1492, I think the attitude towards all these problems in the media about cartoons and so on would be very different. Because people would say, well, Muslims, Protestant nations would say, well, they're a bit superstitious like the Catholics, but they're still one of us. But the fact that Islam is seen as a totally other religion, even though it's part of the Abrahamic family, means that unfortunately we're always seen as being completely alien. For example, one of the great tragedies of the recession of the Ottoman Empire, I made this point in a lecture I gave in Ankara University recently, is that when the Ottoman Empire receded, unfortunately it left behind no actual Muslim countries. Why isn't Bulgaria a Muslim nation? Why is it an Orthodox Christian country? I mean, when British imperialism receded, they left behind lots of white Commonwealth countries like Canada, New Zealand, Australia. Well, why didn't Ottoman Empire, which was the longest lasting dynasty in European history, over almost the age of Cambridge University, almost 800 years, and why didn't we, when we receded and were dismembered during the First World War, how come we left nothing behind? Just Turkey, a small part of the Ottoman Empire, became a secular republic. So, of course, it's true that Islam is not a race, but a universal faith. But in practice, the green belt of Islam stretches from Morocco to Indonesia, the far eastern frontier. Why isn't Islam a religion of Australia? And even more dramatically, why is it that Christianity, a competing colonial rival, is the religion of the Americas, North America, Latin America, South America? There's practically no Muslims there, except for a pocket of them in Guyana. Isn't that a tragedy for a religion that claims to be universal? So yes, I agree that we should identify Islam with a race, but in practice the truth is that, leaving aside 20% of the Arab world, the rest of the Muslim world is mainly in Southeast Asia, Iran onwards up to the far eastern frontier of Indonesia. If we had Muslims de facto in every part of the world, in every continent, then we would be a truly non-racial religion. Christianity is a world religion, by the way, the only world religion, because it is widely distributed on every continent, courtesy of European imperialism. Christians are everywhere. You find Christians in Argentina, you find Christians in North America, Canada, you find them in Australia, the entire globe, in fact. Whereas Islam is in practice, despite being a universal faith, is in the same position as Buddhism. Buddhism is a universal faith, but it's not actually universal. It's only potentially universal. And that's a great failing of the Muslims. And despite, we are being constantly accused by Christian evangelicals of being a missionary faith, look who's talking.
You mentioned that you made predictions 20 years prior. What predictions?
30
years prior. What predictions do you see going forward now for UK Muslims, if you're following current trends?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, there's a biblical New Testament expression that's often used of George Orwell, that he was a prophet with honor in his native land, meaning he made some predictions about the future. And most people believe that his predictions have turned out to be true about 1984. Yeah. I actually don't hold that opinion. I think that Orwell was completely mistaken in all his predictions. So I'm in danger, Mamadou, with the question you ask, of also being proven to be completely mistaken. So I'll be more circumspect than normal and try and give you what I think, because of course, as you know, Allahu Alam, God knows best. I have no knowledge of the ghaib. But as an intelligent person, as the proverb in Farsi says, a sign is enough for the wise. I think there are a number of signs in British culture and more narrowly England, which we need to take heed. And the background for that, in my view, is the Bosnian problem. What happened in Bosnia is a tremendous tragedy, shocking level of brutality perpetrated against Muslims. My question is, why didn't the Bosnians see it coming? I think the chief reason is that when there's a discrepancy between your self-image and how other people see you, this can lead to problems. You do not then make a correct assessment of the dangers facing you. So, for example, the Bosnian case, now I'll come to England in a minute, right, by analogy. The Bosnians thought, well, we are very assimilated. It's the most assimilated European Muslim community in the world, right? And they didn't spare them, okay? Even though the only relic or residue of Islam was often a person's name, Muhammad. He drank, he married, intermarried, he had no interest in religion whatsoever, didn't even know the rules of burial in Islam, thought that you could cremate a body. That level of ignorance, yeah? That's how secular, partly because of the communist rule, to be fair to my Bosnian brothers and sisters. Now, if you think that, well, I'm very assimilated, I'm very secular, my children's names are even secular, nobody's going to attack me if there's an attack, you're wrong. Because to the racist or to the Islamophobe, it doesn't matter whether you have a beard and you're a practicing Muslim, paying zakat, praying 5 times a day, doing Hajj, or you're a secular nominal Muslim who probably never prays, hardly ever prays, and breaks some of the laws of God. Yeah? In the case of a genocide or a massacre, you're all one. You'll all be killed, because the racist is not going to look at gradations of piety, which God knows. So I think that's the main thing, that we must never think that because we're becoming more secularized, more assimilated, that therefore the enemies of Islam will say, these people are one of us. There'll always be the feeling that the Islamic gene is present. It might miss a generation. So, for example, one generation, the current one may be secular or be secularized. What if their children return to Islam? That's always the fear in the mind of the Islamophobes. So I would say be alert to the signs. If you see a degree of racism and violent attacks occurring, try and seek resource, legally of course, try and lobby for this, but do not ignore it. Do not think this cannot happen here because it has never happened here in the past. You do not know the future. So it's not enough to be patient and to pray. You must also do something in the present to prevent the Bosnian tragedy from happening here in Britain.
But in going forward then, what advice would you give to young people here in the West? Like, what should our role as young Muslims be in England?
I think that the most important thing for young Muslims is to find an indigenous leadership that's intrinsic to them, not to look to a previous generation for leadership. Is to produce their own leaders. Right? People in their 20s can start thinking of leadership role and training for it. The main thing is to say, as Tariq Ramadan says, my colleague in Oxford, that we are Europeans. We're Muslim, but we're Europeans. We should look up on ourselves as people who are capable not only of living in British society, but making contributions. Because there are many good and morally attractive things about British values, and I don't need to name them. One of them is punctuality. Sorry, Mamadou, you were 10 minutes late. I bet you edit this bit out, yeah? But we need to have, what Professor Tariq Maudud has called the British gentleman's values. courtesy, fair play, kindness. In social life, a degree of kindness, where people help each other. Unfortunately absent from London, but present in Oxford, where people will, if you look lost, you could ask someone. Here, I think it's quite risky, isn't it, to approach someone and ask them where something is.
People are always in their own heads in London, so they move quite quickly in their own heads. So I feel like when you stop them, it's like you've stopped them out of their routine or out of their patterns. That's what I found anyway in London.
Right. So I'd say, the best of the West, take the best values of the West, particularly of England, and there are many such excellent values.
But is there a clash then between, to take the best of the West, are we Muslims who live in the West? Are we Western Muslims? Are we Muslim first, Western first? How do we navigate this intersection?
Right. Well, that's of course an important point. With regard to the Rushdie affair, we were placed in a predicament or a dilemma where we were asked to make a choice. The test of a mature democracy is that it doesn't ask you very frequently to make such a choice. It doesn't put you in such a difficult condition. However, where it does, my basic principle is that we must compromise regularly and routinely on matters of fashion and taste. Okay. Right, for example, dress to some extent, so long as it's modest, there's no harm in being dressed like people in this country where we live, but never to compromise on matters of principle. I think one of the biggest challenges for young Muslims will be that when they're in a place where they have secular freedoms, away from home, let's say, from university for 3 years living, that there'll be tremendous pressure on them to integrate by, for example, giving into the culture of drugs and alcohol. Those are matters of principle. Yeah. It's very important, very character forming, I think, to decline that. And in time, you will see the virtues and values of that. But at the same time, doing that, not to hold a totally self-righteous position upon the culture that does practice those things. Not to think, well, just because on this point, let's say alcohol or sexuality, etc., this society differs from me, therefore I judge it to be completely irredeemable. I think that's the wrong attitude, because if we are to retrieve ordinary secular people, many of whom are decent human beings, if we are to retrieve them from the errors of secularism and bring them to the light of Islam, we're not going to do that by having no dealings with them. We must talk to them wisely, as the Quran says. Yeah. Although I must admit there are limits to this procedure. For example, I do not think that there's any chance of, let's say, me converting Richard Dawkins to Islam.
But would you want something? Would we even want someone like Richard? No, I'm joking.
Would I want Richard Dawkins to convert to Islam? Well, actually, I'd like a number of these polemical atheists like Sam Harris, but the late Christopher Hitchens, of course, to convert to Islam, because at least we'd have less poison. Because they are remarkably good speakers, very intelligent, very smart, very witty. And unfortunately, from our side, Islam, in my view, has failed to produce philosophers and people with wit and satire. We need that if we are to.
But then, do you not feel, again, these things are not encouraged amongst young Muslims? For example, I know growing up, the people I encountered in Birmingham when I started practicing my faith. So I first got involved with the Salafi movement when I first started.
You got involved
with the Wahhabi Salafi movement? Yeah. Just for the first 6 months. Yeah. And one of the things, thank God, I met other people who were much more level-headed. But one thing that really pushed me out of that door was the lack of me not being allowed to question things. Yeah. And they say, oh, you're going to end up like Bani Israel if you keep questioning things. But you find that that's not me being a sectarian, because that's not a problem that only exists amongst Salafi Wahhabi circles. That exists in the majority of Muslim circles, is that you're not encouraged to question.
Right. I agree with you. I mean, I think sincere, reflective questioning is important. And of course, as you know, within certain limits, the Quran itself encourages believers to think. I say within limits, what I mean by that is that reason, aql, is very important faculty, but it is within the Quranic mind under the supervision of the office of faith. So where there's a conflict between faith and reason on a particular point, obviously as a believer you have to choose faith. I mean, I'm a philosopher, and so if in a sense I have to follow reason, unaided by revelation. But because I'm also a believer, I've done my best to marry these two impulses, so that, and I actually don't think that, I don't think that Islam requires an irrational faith. You know, it has many rules and principles which are subject to you can think about them deeply. Dietary laws, all of them have some basis in health, for example, right? Same with the life of the faith. The fact that we are expected to remember God, say, frequently in a timed ordinance of law, 5 times, canonical prayer. Again, there's a lot of wisdom in that. It takes some effort to understand it. I think the sincere intellectual reasoning by young Muslims is perfectly fine. My difficulty is where the reasoning is done out of mockery and satire. You know that the person has no interest in believing in Islam and is not open-minded. He or she has made up their mind, which I think is the danger from people like Sam Harris and others who are fanatical atheists, who are absolutely dedicated to, they're not actually reasonable at all. I think that they're quite irrational in their beliefs. So in their case, even if there were a dramatic miracle today, let's say, some words appearing in the heavens, and I think they still won't believe. So that's my concern, that with different types of atheism, you have to look at the level of whether it's conscientious atheism. I respect conscientious atheism, where somebody's taken a lifetime to think carefully. Like Europe as a culture has taken 400 years of conscientious philosophical reasoning, moral reasoning to reject Christianity. So obviously they have a reason. I personally think that if they examine Islam sincerely, without malice, they would find that Islam does not suffer from many of the objections that have been made against Christianity on matters of dogma, and Christianity is very juvenile record on politics, genocides, killings. Islam has had a very honourable and lenient ascendancy throughout its 1400 years.
Yeah.
I'm good with that, Faisal. Would you?
Yeah, I think so. Have we touched on like the kind of the political climate amongst young Muslims, and like how I feel like the majority of young Muslims have like a very conservative mindset politically, and they all subscribe to the same kind of political ideology. There's not much diversity when it comes to
I feel that'd be a good
Muslim politics.
Is that right? Is that okay?
Okay. Yeah, of course.
Yeah. Very good.
Yeah.
I'll go for it.
Are you going to formulate that?
Yeah, I'm just thinking of formulating it.
Do you know what I'm trying to get at?
Yeah, I do know what you're thinking, because I have.
They all come from a specific political background.
Very good observation, Faisal. I like that.
Yeah. Maybe we can touch a bit about how there seems to be a lack of diversity amongst young Muslims. So you have Muslims, obviously Muslims are a diverse spectrum in the UK. Right. Then you have those who fit into the practicing camp. Then you have those who, within that camp, is those who consider themselves to be activists within that camp. But they all seem to be hailing from one linear background of conservative politics, if that makes sense.
Right. So the question is, why isn't there a diversity? Yeah. Well, I think the reason actually is that the crucible within which divergent political solidarities and views emerge requires a degree of freedom of reasoning and speech and intellect. Unfortunately, because most Muslims have been reasoning in the defensive context of an attack on Islam from the mainstream culture, their politics has been reactionary by definition. Because if you're being attacked and being attacked in the same way, and only a particular type of person is being attacked, let's say the practicing believer, rather than the one who doesn't practice, then obviously their political primary motivation will be conservative in the literal sense of wanting to conserve a heritage. And for that, the type of politics that's appropriate to that will be conservative, as you call it. It won't, for example, be one that is intuitively aligned to a pluralist outlook. Yeah. My last conference a year ago was in Morocco. And there was a major conference on the need for pluralism in the Muslim world. And of course, in the context, it was about respect for secularism, as long as that secularism is not polemical or hostile to Islam, a tolerant secularism. Remember, secularism is not just one thing, there's different types of it, just like different types of Islam. I think that a pluralist politics or diversity of political attitudes is too much to ask for in the short run, and that such a politics will itself be the result of a perception by Muslims, including activist Muslims, that the host culture is respecting their political choices and not just thinking of them simply as a problematic community. That Muslims are nothing but troublemakers, they have nothing new or novel to contribute. So for example, as we develop the voluntary welfare sector and people see that we're making contributions to things and that we're not just simply grumbling all the time with grievances about our rights have been denied, then I think you'll find a more diverse politics emerging. For example, what's to stop Muslims from being interested in ecology and joining the Green Party? Although I must add in fairness that they're not likely to win.
Exactly. Alhamdulillah. I'm happy with that. I'm happy with that, Dr. Shabbir. Thank you.
Thank you very much.